All right, hello everybody. Good afternoon, and welcome to our Engel rounds for February. Our presenter today is David Dodell-Feder from the Department of Psychology here at the University of Rochester. And before I introduce him, I just wanted to make some general comments, especially for the people watching this over Zoom. One is that your cameras and microphones will be off during the presentation. We hope people have questions or comments at the end. And if you do, that's great. Just make sure that you write them in the Q&A box, not in the chat box, which we're reserving for the panelists and the interpreters. And also, I'd like everyone to remember to fill out the evaluation after the presentation. There'll be a link for that that'll come up on the screen, and it'll come up in the chat as well. For people here in the audience, there'll be a QR code that'll come up on the screen. So just take a picture of that on your phone and it'll take it to the evaluation. All right, so today's speaker is Dr. David Dodell-Feder from the Department of Psychology here at the University of Rochester. David actually completed his undergraduate education at the University of Rochester and got his degree from the Brain and Cognitive Sciences Department. He then went to Harvard University where he got a master's degree in clinical psychology and got his doctorate in clinical psychology as well. And then he did his internship at the New York Presbyterian Hospital while Cornell Medical Center in New York City. After that, he did a postdoc for a while at McLean Hospital and Harvard Medical School before then coming back here in 2018 to be on the faculty in the Department of Psychology in the clinical psychology program. What can I say about David? He's quite an impressive researcher and all-around guy. He's got over 40 publications. Many of them are on the neural basis of social cognition, social information processing, as well as on schizophrenia and also on fMRI-based neurofeedback. So today he'll be talking about schizophrenia and the social brain. Let's welcome Dr. Dodell-Feder.
Thanks, Steve, for that introduction, and thank you so much for the invitation to give this talk. I consider it to be a really high honor. So, as Steve said, I'm an assistant professor in the Department of Psychology over on River Campus. I'm a clinical psychologist by training, and for the past couple of years, my lab and I have been doing work on the social brain and schizophrenia. Today, I'm going to tell you about some of that work, and I'm going to tell you about some other work that's kind of tangentially related to that stuff that's also, I think, interesting and fun. So just before I start, I just want to acknowledge some of the people who have helped me to do some of the work I'm going to tell you about today. My lab, the Social Cognition Psychopathology Lab, I'm going to tell you a lot about the work of two graduate students in my lab in particular, Bridget Shavestel and Abhishek Saxena, both of whom are going to be on the job market very soon. If anyone's, yeah, cool, we'll talk. And then lots of other people who have provided tons of logistical support. So people like Steve Lamberti, Steve Silverstein. Is that better? Yeah. Okay. The UR Psychosis Research Group, Rob Weissman, people at Strong Ties, and also folks at Cabin, our neuroimaging center, in addition to my funding sources. Okay. So in 1988, the editor of the journal Nature said in a commentary the following: schizophrenia is arguably the worst disease affecting mankind. Now, this is a really incredible statement to make, but especially in the late 1980s, which was just about the height of the AIDS epidemic. Plenty of people would disagree with this statement, although it's easy to see where this editor was coming from if you take a look at some of the outcome data. So schizophrenia is a top 10 leading cause of disability worldwide. Folks with this and related disorders have a really high unemployment rate. These disorders carry a profound economic burden that's well outsized in relation to its relatively small incidence. Folks with these disorders have or experience a large reduction in quality of life in virtually all areas. People with these disorders also experience a really high level of social disconnection, which is associated with its own set of adverse health consequences. The suicide rate is markedly elevated, and the life expectancy is about 20 years below the general population. So if you put this information together, people with these disorders are likely to live shorter lives that are characterized by substantial periods of disability and reduced quality of life, which poses an enormous social, emotional, and economic burden for the affected individual, their family, and society at large. So there are a lot of really important questions to be asked here. And I just quit out of the slides. Is the AV person here? Oh, hi.
Use the clicker? No. Well, yeah, there is a way to do it.
Can you show me? Thank you so much. Yeah. No, I'm all set. Okay. So like I was saying, there are a lot of really important questions to be asked here. And for me, some of the most important questions are things like, how do we better understand risk? What contributes to social disconnection? One of these often overlooked and poorly understood aspects of the disorder that also might be one of the most consequential. And how can we leverage research and insights from other related areas of research, like cognitive neuroscience, relationship science, social psychology, and even the arts and humanities to improve our interventions and our attempts at psychosis prevention? So in the past couple of years in my lab, we've been trying to address these and related questions using a multi-method approach that includes behavioral testing, experience sampling, and functional MRI. And part of what I wanted to do today was to give everyone a feel for the type of work that we've been doing over on River Campus. So on risk, a lot of our work is motivated by the idea that adverse social experiences and certain aspects of the physical and chemical environment contribute to risk in important ways. For example, in a new study we just finished that was led by Bridget Chevestel and an undergraduate honors thesis student in my lab, Mars Scharf, we've found that chronic forms of social defeat, so things like daily experiences of discrimination and bullying and ostracism, is associated with outcomes that are part of this broader psychosis phenotype. In a series of projects that was led by Abhishek Saxena, we've been using data from the Adolescent Brain and Cognitive Development Study, which is a longitudinal nationwide study of 9 and 10-year-olds. And we found that similar adverse social experiences contributes to increased risk for having psychotic-like experiences, and distressing ones at that. And part of this association can be accounted for by the functioning of a brain network that's important for social information processing. In other projects we've been doing using this data set, we've replicated this really robust, well-studied association between urbanicity and psychotic-like experiences in pre-adolescence. And importantly, we've also shown that a large proportion of the variance in this association can actually be explained by urban-related exposures. So things like income inequality and poverty and pollution. This pollution finding is really intriguing to me, so we've been following up this finding by conducting a meta-analysis on the association between air pollution and risk for psychosis or psychosis-related outcomes. And sure enough, we're finding that air pollution does indeed increase risk for these psychosis-related outcomes. So this in turn is motivating some other work that we're doing in collaboration with Marissa Sobolewski in the Environmental Health Sciences Department to see if we could develop an animal model of air pollution, resource inequality, and psychosis. On the second question, what contributes to social disconnection, we've been testing a variety of theories that have been proposed to explain the association between social disconnection and the onset of psychosis. And we've also been investigating some candidate processes that are suggested by the affective science literature to play an important role in how socially connected we are. So for example, we found support for aspects of a theory that describes psychosis as the consequence of reduced social motivation, which reduces social network size, which is hypothesized to lead to this harmful reorganization of the social brain in a way that produces aberrant sensory experiences, much like you would find in a phantom limb syndrome. More recently, in a project that was led by Bridget, we used daily diary methods to evaluate how accurately people with schizophrenia can predict their future emotional experience for meaningful social interactions. And in fact, we've found that people with schizophrenia are less accurate at forecasting how they're going to feel in a future social interaction. And the extent of inaccuracy is related to the extent of social amotivation and a lack of social pleasure. On interventions, we've said some things. We have some ideas about this, but we haven't done much empirical work in this area, although this is an area we're eager to advance our efforts in. Okay, so that's some of the things that we've been doing over the past couple of years. Today, I want to spend most of my time telling you about some of the newer directions in my lab that lie at the intersection of these two things, social disconnection and intervention. And I'm going to tell you about two studies in particular. I'm going to tell you about a NARSAD-funded study in which we used a neuroimaging technique called real-time fMRI neurofeedback to see if we can train people with and without schizophrenia to self-regulate a brain network that's important for social information processing and that we think is contributing to social connection. I'm then going to tell you about a study that was funded by the National Endowment for the Arts, in which we evaluated this idea that fiction reading causally improves social cognition. And this idea that perhaps, if that's the case, maybe fiction reading has some clinical utility for folks who experience social deficits. And I'll start with the real-time fMRI neurofeedback study. So the general motivation for this project is fairly simple, and it has, well, it doesn't have much to do with MRI. It's the idea that social connection is a fundamental human need. Said simply, we thrive in social relationships and we wither in isolation. And a large body of research supports this idea. So our extent of social connection or lack thereof is intimately tied to our health and well-being. The less socially connected we are, the more likely we are to have mental health problems, the more likely we are to experience physical illness, and the earlier we die. Now, I'd argue that these associations are especially important in the case of schizophrenia. And that's because people with schizophrenia experience marked and persistent and treatment-resistant difficulties related to social connection. It's harder for these folks to have effective and successful social interactions, to form meaningful social relationships, to have positive, high-quality, high-pleasure social interactions. And perhaps as a result, this is why we also know that people with schizophrenia report fewer daily social interactions, they have smaller social networks, and they report reduced social support. So this means that people with schizophrenia are less likely to reap the benefits of social connection and are more likely to suffer the damaging consequences of being socially disconnected on these outcomes. So a question I've been long interested in is what's contributing to these social difficulties and how do we treat them? Now, social connection is multiply determined by probably a large number of internal and external factors, and there's probably not one thing we could point to and say, this is why these people are socially disconnected. That being said, I think there are some candidate factors that seem to be a big player. And for the last many years, we've been focusing on one such process, which seems to be particularly important. And that's the process by which we attribute and reason about the mental states of others, a process known as theory of mind. So there's a really rich literature from other areas of psychology and cognitive science demonstrating that our tendency to think about the mental states of others, so other people's beliefs, desires, intentions, and wishes, and our ability to do so thoughtfully and accurately plays a critical role in how effective we are at navigating the social world. Now, this is hard for people in general. It's probably easy for all of us to think of instances in which we've misunderstood someone, misjudged someone's intentions. Maybe we had a hard time understanding why somebody else felt the way that they did. Well, this is even harder for people with a schizophrenia spectrum disorder. So meta-analyses show that theory of mind is impaired in schizophrenia, and these impairments are fairly large in magnitude. Speaking to the importance of theory of mind for social connection, the extent of theory of mind impairment is associated with the extent of daily functioning impairments. Even further, speaking to the importance of theory of mind impairment explains more variance in social functioning than do other aspects of the illness, including non-social aspects of cognition and even other aspects of social cognition. So together, this suggests that theory of mind may be contributing to social disconnection in schizophrenia. Now, a critical question related to this work is, to what extent do these deficits reflect disruption in theory of mind per se versus other aspects of cognition that are disrupted in the illness? And I think this is where neuroimaging data have been somewhat useful. So now, 2 decades of neuroimaging research has shown that theory of mind is subserved by a distinct network of brain regions that are selectively recruited for theory of mind, often called the theory of mind network. And this includes brain regions such as the temporoparietal junction, or TPJ, the superior temporal sulcus, or STS, medial prefrontal cortex, or MPFC, and the precuneus. Oh, sorry. So this network responds preferentially to mental state information, beliefs, thoughts, desires, intentions, wishes, across a wide variety of stimulus presentation formats and tasks in which mental state attribution is either deliberate and directed or implicit and spontaneous. So activation of these regions don't reflect language processing, they don't reflect inhibitory control, they reflect the cognitive process of thinking about other people's thoughts. Having this network is nice because it allows us to test hypotheses about the nature of theory of mind impairment in schizophrenia. Is it due to impairment in this specialized network, or is it due to impairments in other networks supporting other cognitive processes? And this is where we've done some prior work. So for example, we've shown that on well-controlled and widely used theory of mind measures, these brain regions show less selectivity for mental state information in people with schizophrenia. Using multivariate techniques like multivoxel pattern analysis, we've shown that the representational content of these regions for the category of mental states is altered in schizophrenia. We've also found disruption to this network in schizophrenia using more naturalistic stimuli. So in an ongoing study that's being led by Emily Prazinda, an MD PhD student in my lab, and Bridget, we have people with schizophrenia watch an entire episode of The Office in the scanner, which, as it turns out, is a great social stimulus for psychology experiments. If you've ever seen The Office, you know that it features these horribly uncomfortable, awkward, and inappropriate social situations, which tap into a really rich suite of social cognitive processes, mental state attribution included. So for this study, what we do is we take these continuous ratings of awkwardness that other participants have provided us while watching the show, and we evaluate how closely neural activity in theory of mind regions track with these awkwardness ratings. And we're finding that people with schizophrenia, some of these regions in the network, namely medial prefrontal cortex, are not tracking as tightly with these awkwardness ratings. So in other words, this brain region that we know is really important and critical for social information processing isn't coming online precisely during those moments when it should. And that might be contributing to difficulty understanding other people in the context of real-world social interaction. And then finally, we've shown across a variety of studies that neural activity in these brain regions is associated with social cognitive performance outside of the scanner, and daily reports of perspective taking and empathy and daily social functioning. And a lot of these kind of neural differences and brain behavior relationships have been replicated by other labs. So if we put this together, these marked and persistent and treatment-resistant theory of mind impairments that we're seeing in schizophrenia that's contributing to social dysfunction seems to be mediated in part by disruption to the theory of mind network, which is nice in the sense that it gives us a neurobiological target for intervention. If we remediate this impaired neural system, maybe we improve social connection. Okay, so the question then becomes, how do we manipulate our neural target? And our idea was that we could modulate this network using real-time fMRI. So real-time fMRI is this non-invasive neuroimaging technique in which brain function is measured and analyzed in real time and then presented back to participants in the form of neurofeedback. And by providing this window into one's own neural activity as it unfolds in real-time fMRI presents an opportunity to gain awareness around and subsequently control important processes associated with those brain states that are being directly manipulated by the participant in the scanner. So in a typical real-time fMRI experiment, a participant is put in the scanner and they're asked to either increase or decrease neural activity or some other neural outcome while they're in the scanner. Sometimes participants are provided with explicit strategies for how to do this, other times they're not. Brain function is then measured in real time, it's analyzed in real time, and then it's presented back to the participant in the form of some sort of neurofeedback signal. So often that could be a smiley face, a bar graph, a number, something like that, something that's easily understood by the participant. And then using that neurofeedback, the individual has an opportunity to basically understand how manipulating the strategy manipulates those brain states. So there are a lot of promises to this approach. I mean, for one, it allows you to build interventions that are directly targeting neural systems or brain regions that are implicated in the pathophysiology of a disorder or a symptom. It also allows for a personalization. So the ultimate goal is volitional control of a brain region, but the way I might do that might be very different from the way you might do that. And that's okay. However you get there, it doesn't matter as long as you get there. Okay, and then it's also well tolerated and there aren't any known side effects besides any side effects that are associated with just kind of standard MRI. So real-time fMRI was first developed in the mid-90s. Its first clinical application was in 2005 when it was used with folks with a chronic pain. And since then, there have actually been a decent number of studies that have been testing to see whether folks with a variety of psychiatric illnesses can be trained to self-regulate a variety of brain regions that are implicated in the pathophysiology of a disorder or a symptom. So before doing our own real-time fMRI neurofeedback study, we wanted to get a better understanding of this literature. So at the time, my lab manager, Emily Dudek, and I decided to do a meta-analysis of the literature, where we were basically asking this question: does real-time fMRI neurofeedback for psychiatric disorders lead to volitional control of the targeted brain region in the context of a randomized controlled trial where some folks got active neurofeedback and other folks got a placebo control or sham neurofeedback? So most often people will test this in two different tasks. They'll test this in the context of a training task in which someone is told to increase or decrease the neural signal, and then they're actively provided with neurofeedback. They'll also test this in the context of what's called a transfer task, in which they perform the same exact task, but they're not given neurofeedback. And this is a really critical test of learning or generalization. So in a context in which you're not actively receiving that neurofeedback online as you're manipulating those brain states, can people still show self-regulation of the network? They learn something about how to manipulate those brain states. And then you compare neural activity between the active and sham neurofeedback group in the neurofeedback target. Okay, so here are the data from our meta-analysis. We looked at 4 different outcomes: volitional control during the training task, volitional control during the transfer task, symptoms, and cognition. And what we found for both the training and transfer task is a positive effect of neurofeedback. That is, people who got the active neurofeedback intervention were more likely to show volitional control of the neurofeedback target than folks who got the placebo intervention. We also saw a small but positive effect on symptoms and a small effect on cognition, although that effect was not statistically significant. Okay, so we thought, hey, this looks pretty good. This looks pretty promising. Maybe we could use this method to train people with schizophrenia to gain volitional control over the theory of mind network in a way that's going to have some positive real-world consequences in terms of improving social connection. So with the help of Abhishek and Bridget, we conducted 2 proof of concept, single arm, so no control group, pre-registered studies. And we did it with 2 groups. We first did it in a group of people without schizophrenia. These were just folks from the community. We basically wanted to make sure that we could set up a real-time fMRI pipeline at our neuroimaging center, which, as it turns out, is incredibly challenging. It probably took us close to a year to set this up. And I lost tons of sleep over it, but we were able to set it up. And we also wanted to make sure that the data looked good, right? Folks were showing volitional control. So we recruited a group of 16 people who on average were in their mid-40s, mostly female at birth, identified as women, mostly white and non-Hispanic or Latino, who were fairly well educated. Once we saw again, that things were kind of looking as they should, we started recruiting a group of people with schizophrenia. So we recruited 8 people to do this who on average were in their late 30s, female at birth, identified as women, white, non-Hispanic or Latino, and had at least a high school diploma or GED. I'm mostly going to tell you about the data from this study with non-schizophrenia participants, just because we've pretty much finished analyzing the data and are writing up that manuscript right now. So here's what the procedure looked like. People came in for an initial behavioral testing session, and then they came back for 4 separate fMRI sessions. In the first session, we localized the neurofeedback target, and then in the following 3 sessions, they did a real-time fMRI neurofeedback training paradigm. And then they came back for a follow-up behavioral visit. So as part of the behavioral visit, we conducted clinical assessments, cognitive assessments. We assessed a couple of hypothesized moderators, and we also assessed performance on a number of different social cognitive tasks. I'm not going to tell you about these data, but I'm happy to take questions about them. In terms of the neurofeedback target, we decided to target the temporoparietal junction, or TPJ, and we did this for a couple of reasons. The first is that the TPJ shows a response profile indicating that this region is particularly selective for mental state information. For example, in studies in which people evaluate neural response to mental states versus other internal states versus other bits of social information, the TPJ shows this selective profile where it responds most robustly to the mental state information, but not other bits of social information. The other reason we decided to target the TPJ is because there's more and more evidence suggesting that the TPJ is causally involved in theory of mind. That is, it's necessary for theory of mind. And a lot of those data come from lesion studies. So folks with damage to the TPJ will show this selective impairment in reasoning about the mental states of others, but will do fine on tests of memory and inhibitory control. There's also an increasing body of literature in which folks are using TMS and TDCS to stimulate the TPJ. And stimulating the TPJ impairs people's ability to either spontaneously attend to or reason about mental states of others, or use mental state information to make judgments about other people's behavior. Okay, so to localize the TPJ in our study, we had participants performed a well-used theory of mind task in the scanner called the false belief task. So in this task, people read 2 types of vignettes describing false or outdated belief states, and vignettes describing false or outdated physical representations of the world, like an old map or an old photograph that is no longer accurate. And when you compare neural activity for false belief versus false photo, you get really nice, robust recruitment of the theory of mind network, TPJ included. And in fact, here I'm just showing you maps of the individually localized TPJ regions from our participants that we selected as the neurofeedback target. Okay, participants then completed these 3 separate real-time fMRI neurofeedback sessions, in which they did 4 runs of our training task and 1 run of our transfer task. So for our training task, we instructed people to either increase or decrease neural activity in their TPJ. Now, before putting them in the scanner, we gave them some instruction for how to do this. So we gave them some basic information about what we know the TPJ responds to, what it doesn't respond to, and then we had participants generate for us some example strategies they might use while they're in the scanner to self-regulate the network, just to make sure that people were kind of thinking about this in an expected way. Okay, and then we delivered neurofeedback to them. So here, neurofeedback was median % signal change in the TPJ for that regulation block relative to the prior baseline block. We took that value, we scaled it to have a value between 0 and 100, and it was accompanied by a happy face that was also scaled to match how well the person was doing. The transfer task was exactly the same, except no neurofeedback was provided. Again, this is our critical test of learning and generalization. Okay, now, if people can volitionally control the network, we would expect to see greater neural activity for upregulation versus downregulation in both the training and the transfer task. So a greater difference between these 2 conditions are indicative of greater volitional control. Now, one of our main goals was to figure out what strategies best led to volitional control. So what are you thinking about when you're increasing the neural signal, and what are you thinking about when you're decreasing the neural signal that best leads to volitional control of the region? So in order to do that, after each real-time fMRI neurofeedback session, we had participants complete a survey describing their experience, which included telling us in as much detail as possible, what were you thinking about when you were increasing the neural signal and what you were thinking about when you were decreasing the neural signal. We took those data and we submitted them to linguistic inquiry and word count Luke software, which is a dictionary-based text analysis software tool that provides just the proportion of words that fall into a number of different categories. Here, we used 47 different psychological categories. So for example, the proportion of words that are related to positive affect, negative affect, social things, things to do with work. Okay, so our first question. Do participants demonstrate volitional control of the theory of mind network? We evaluated this question by performing region of interest analyses. So we used that same false belief task to localize the rest of the theory of mind network and interrogated neural activity in those regions. Here I'm just showing you data from our 2 neurofeedback targets, the TPJ, as well as dorsal medial prefrontal cortex and the precuneus. Okay, so I'm going to show you a bunch of plots that look like this. I'm plotting the beta values on the y-axis for the upregulation condition, the downregulation condition for our 3 different neurofeedback training sessions. Okay, so here I have violin plots that are depicting the distribution. The solid dot and bars or lines represent mean neural activity, plus or minus 95% confidence interval. And then each gray line is depicting a single participant's up and down paired regulation value. Okay, so here there's pretty clearly an effect of the real-time fMRI neurofeedback. We're seeing greater neural activity for up versus down regulation, and it's a fairly big effect. The effect size here is over a Cohen's d of 1. I'll also mention we found no effect of session, and we found no regulation by session interaction. So the neurofeedback didn't change over the course of the 3 training sessions. The pattern of data looked almost exactly the same for the other regions in the theory of mind network, where again, these regions were showing greater neural activity for up versus down regulation, and the magnitude effect was large to extremely large. Okay, here are the data for the transfer test. Again, this is our perhaps more critical test of whether people can self-regulate the network without actively getting the neurofeedback signal. So in LTPJ, we did see a main effect of regulation such that neural activity was greater for up versus down regulation. That was a medium-sized effect, although it's clearly less robust than the training effect, which is depicted on the left side. The effect varied by region of interest. So we didn't see a significant effect of regulation. So neural activity for up versus down regulation wasn't different in the RTPJ, but we did see a nice transfer effect in the dorsal MPFC and precuneus. Okay, now we also looked just to see whether there were any other regions outside of the network that responded to neurofeedback training, and so we conducted whole brain random effects analysis, which I'm depicting for you here. The training effect is in blue, the transfer effect is in red, and the overlap of the 2 tasks is in purple. And these results pretty much line up with our region of interest analysis. We see pretty good recruitment of the theory of mind network for the training task, and then less robust recruitment of the transfer task, but it is there for some regions. Okay, so the answer here seems to be yes. It seems to differ a little bit by region, and as expected, the transfer effect was less robust. Okay, so for our next question, what strategies are associated with volitional control? Again, to do this, we took participants' description of what they were doing when increasing and decreasing the neural signal. We passed these data through Luke, which gave us the proportion of words that fell into 47 different psychological dimensions. And then we used a statistical technique called partial least squares regression, which is this multivariate latent variable approach to modeling the covariance between some components and an outcome. So essentially what we're doing is we're running a principal components analysis on these 47 Luke features, and those components are generated in such a way as to maximize the amount of variance that you're explaining in your outcome. And here, our outcome was volitional control on the transfer task specifically, because again, we're thinking that that's our most important outcome. Ultimately, we want to be able to explain what it is that people are thinking about that kind of generalizes to a context without neurofeedback being provided in a way that leads to volitional control. Okay, so here I'm just going to show you the data for the LTBJ and the text data from when we asked people to tell us what they were thinking about when they were upregulating. Part of the reason I'm showing you data from LTBJ is because we did the best job explaining variance in terms of volitional control. So the regression model suggested that 8 components were sufficient, and they explained pretty much all of the variance in volitional control and the Luke features. So here are those first 3 components, which together explain 75% of the variance in volitional control. And here I'm just plotting the loading. So on each row, we have a different Luke feature. A blue loading is a positive going loading, which indicates a positive association between the feature and the component. And red is a negative going loading between the feature and the component. So the first component is very clearly, in my mind, a social component. It loads most heavily on social things, social words like relationship, party, and awkward, affiliation words, things like friend, compassion, and flirting, and drives, things like success, bullying, and benefit. The second component loaded heavily on past experiences. So words like did, talk, believe, things like that, kind of social things that people did in one's past. And the last component loaded heavily on this work feature, so words like job, office, and work, male features, so references to males, boy, his dad, and family, so words like family, mother, and grandkid. So pretty much social things. Thinking about social things is what's driving volitional control in this region. I'll mention that for many of the other brain regions, those data were best summarized by a single component, which look exactly like this social component. Also say that we didn't do as good of a job explaining volitional control for downregulation. So when we analyzed the text data for downregulation, we didn't do as good a job explaining variance in volitional control. But qualitatively speaking, people talked about, thinking about inanimate objects, about paying attention to things that they saw and felt while they were being scanned. Okay, so in terms of what strategies are associated with volitional control, I mean, I think these data pretty clearly show that it's social experiences, which isn't perhaps super surprising, but it's, I guess, a nice data-driven way of confirming that it is social things that's driving neural activity in this network and in this neurofeedback target. We would like to make some more granular inferences about what people are thinking and how that maps onto volitional control. So we're exploring alternative methods for doing this, things like topic modeling. Okay, now I do just want to show you some of the data that we've been analyzing from the group of participants with schizophrenia. This analysis is in progress. It's being led by a graduate student in my lab, Beth Cruz. So just to remind you, here are the whole brain maps depicting the neurofeedback effect for 2 different tasks, transfer, training, and their overlap. And then here are the data for 3 different schizophrenia participants, neural activity for up versus down regulation. Training effects are depicted on the left, transfer effects on the right. If you're looking at the left side of the screen, the transfer effects, you should see pretty robust recruitment of the network, which is really great. Although I'll also say this is a very generous and liberal threshold. On the right side of the screen, the transfer task, those effects are definitely less robust, similar to the non-schizophrenia data, and they do seem to vary a bit by participant, where participant 1, for example, clearly isn't showing much of a transfer effect, while participant 3 is. Okay, so in terms of summary and future directions, real-time fMRI seems to be feasible here at Cabin. We can conduct these studies, and using real-time fMRI, we can train people to gain volitional control over aspects of the theory of mind network. The effect does seem to differ a bit by region, and the transfer effects, which are the critical effects, right? Can people do this without actively receiving neurofeedback, are a little bit less robust. We also showed you that social strategies seem to best account for volitional control. And I just wanted to mention one exciting future direction that's being done in collaboration with Steve Silverstein. We'll be testing whether we can use real-time fMRI to train people with a psychosis risk syndrome to gain volitional control over the default mode network. And we'll be doing this by recruiting people at Steve's new Intercept clinic, which is the only psychosis risk clinic in Western New York, and with support from the Del Monte Institute. Okay, so that's real-time fMRI. Now, back, I guess when I was in graduate school and I was initially thinking about social deficits in schizophrenia, theory of mind impairments, and methods of remediation, I was starting to think a lot about the opposite end of the social ability spectrum. So social experts, for example, people who seem to be really skilled at social cognition. The idea being that maybe there's something about these people, they have a certain characteristic or trait, or they have a certain experience that we could leverage for some type of intervention that maybe has clinical utility, right? Something that we can give to somebody with trouble, reasoning about the mental states of others, and this experience in improving that ability. And that brought me to a small, but also really fascinating literature on how fiction readers may be such social experts. So for a long time, scholars have posed this question of whether stories can help people to understand one another. And for an equally long period of time, scholars have generally thought the answer to be yes. And part of the reason is that fiction tends to be about people and social interaction and those people's emotions and internal experiences. And it might be that intense or repeated exposure to these things changes how we think about people for the better, right? Maybe it gives us an intimate peek into somebody else's experience in a way that fosters empathy that we can leverage in our day-to-day social interactions. I think anecdotally too, I feel like I talk to people about this literature a lot, and everyone can kind of name that bookworm. So, everyone knows somebody who just reads fiction all the time. They're in multiple book clubs and they happen to have superb social skills. Conversely, many of us might know people who never read fiction. They can't tell you who Ernest Hemingway is, and their social skills are incredibly poor. Okay, so do we have strong theoretical reason to believe that fiction reading might positively impact social skills? I mean, it's one thing if fiction is just about people, but clearly something else must be going on if we think that there's a causal association here. So one framework says that stories positively impact social ability through two routes. The first route being a process route. So it's this idea that fiction reading recruits the very same social processes that we recruit in daily social interaction. And it might be that through repeated engagement in those practices, it serves as a form of practice where we can hone those social information processing skills. And so folks have described fiction as the mind's flight simulator for social experiences, I think getting at that idea nicely. And there's some kind of, there's actually plenty of neuroimaging work to support this idea. So for example, reading narratives, reading fiction engages the very same network that we engage when we're thinking about the minds of other people, the theory of mind network. Okay, the second route is thought to be a content route. So in other words, fiction might provide concrete social information about other people. And in doing so, it allows people to build their social knowledge about other people, other social experiences, other cultures in a way that we can use to our benefit in real-world social interaction. Okay, so do we have any empirical reason to believe that fiction reading positively influences social ability? And we do. There are data from correlational studies showing that greater exposure to lifetime exposure to fiction is positively associated with things like empathy and theory of mind performance. And there was a meta-analysis of this data set a couple of years ago that showed this really nicely. Now, the correlational data is awesome, it's super interesting, but of course we need experimental studies to get at this causal question, right? It might just be that people who are better at theory of mind, who enjoy thinking about other people and mental states more, happen to enjoy reading fiction more, right? And if we want this to be a thing that maybe has some clinical utility of sorts, we would want to be able to show a causal effect. And again, we can do that in part with experimental studies. So there were a number of experimental studies at the time showing that if you randomly assign people to read a really short work of fiction, like a short story, a short work of nonfiction, or nothing at all, the people who read the short work of fiction outperform others on tests of theory of mind, empathy, and other things like that. And a colleague and I showed this in a meta-analysis of the literature that we did a couple of years ago. Now, that being said, it has a positive effect on social ability, but the effect is very small. And it's also not the most robust, right? So this is maybe tenuous support for the idea that fiction reading might be causally contributing to social ability. That being said, there are tons of limitations to this experimental work. For one, folks will assess social ability with a limited number of measures. Often it's the same measure, the reading the mind and the eyes task, which we have shown in other research to be flawed in a variety of ways. The experimental studies usually involve a very short exposure to fiction. Like, you're reading a short story, 15 minutes, and that's it. And this doesn't really well approximate how people engage with literature in their day-to-day lives, which tends to be a little bit more intense. It's also has poor resemblance to real world reading, in which people also have agency over what they're reading, the context in which they're reading, etc. So we thought it would be really useful to replicate these findings and boost the effect, right? Let's see how big we can make that difference for fiction readers. And we're going to do that by having people engage in the most intensive fiction reading manipulation at the time. Which involved reading 45 minutes a day, 5 days a week for 4 weeks. And again, that's in comparison to the rest of the literature where folks were typically having people read fiction for maybe 15 minutes at a time. So we conducted a pre-registered study evaluating fiction's impact on a variety of social outcomes compared to reading nonfiction or engaging in no pleasure reading. We collected data from 287 people and ended up with complete data sets from 210 people. I'm happy to tell you more about why attrition was so high. A lot of it had to do with COVID though. On average, folks were in their early 20s, female at birth, white, non-Hispanic, Latino, and were in college, had some education. Okay, in terms of a procedure, we brought people in for a pre-reading session where we assessed theory of mind, empathy, social functioning. We assessed a couple of hypothesized moderators. So we thought that people's narrative transportation, so the more they were immersed and absorbed into the reading and the characters' mental states, the bigger the impact on social outcomes. We also measured lifetime fiction exposure because we wanted to see if we could replicate this association between lifetime fiction exposure and social ability. We randomly assigned people to read fiction, nonfiction, or no reading at all. We had them read if they were assigned to the fiction or nonfiction group for 45 minutes a day, 5 days a week, 4 weeks. People completed daily reading questionnaires. So anytime they read, they completed a questionnaire telling us what they read, how much they enjoyed the reading. They completed a set of attention checks specific to those readings as well to make sure that people weren't just lying to us. We provided the material electronically. A lot of the fiction work was kind of classic literature, stuff that we took from other studies in this field. The nonfiction material was non-social in nature, is mostly about natural science topics like fermentation and feces, among other things. And then we had people come back to the lab for a post-reading session where they did many of the same things. So we assessed this question, does fiction reading kind of causally impact social ability by using structural equation modeling? And so in this model with group as our predictor, our outcome were scores on these 3 different latent variables. Post-reading, we found this, which is not a ton of differences between the groups on our 3 latent variables, theory of mind, empathy, and social functioning. In fact, our nonfiction group seemed to outperform the other groups. And we did find one significant difference, and that was between nonfiction and no readers. So people who read nonfiction outperformed people who engaged in no pleasure reading during the study period on empathy. And these results didn't change when we controlled for demographic variables or reading ability. So the answer here seemed to be no. Next, we wanted to see if we could replicate this association between lifetime fiction reading and social ability. So we conducted a similar SEM. This time, we added lifetime fiction exposure as an additional predictor to the model. So here, I'm plotting the association between the latent variable and lifetime fiction exposure. And the effects were positive for theory of mind and empathy, but very small and not significantly different from 0. And results were unchanged after controlling for demographic features and reading ability. So the answer here too seems to be no. Steve, I'm running out of time. Yes. Okay, great. I'm gonna skip that. So there's a lot to account for here, because not only did we not boost the size of the effect, we failed to replicate other findings showing this kind of small advantage for fiction readers on social outcomes. we have a number of what I think are really good explanations for what happened. I mean, one possibility is that people were also producing or consuming other forms of narrative media during the study period. And there's actually some literature showing that watching television shows improves theory of mind. Writing about social things also improves theory of mind. So potentially our nonfiction readers, our no pleasure readers were doing some of that. The effect might also be a prime. So it might just be that if you read about something social, you're more likely to think about social things right afterwards in a way that improves performance on some of these social measures. This is a nice explanation for a lot of the experimental literature in which folks will read a short amount of fiction and get tested on some sort of social ability test immediately afterwards. In our study, people came back to the lab a day, 2, sometimes 3 days after the last time that they read. So if it is a prime, we would have missed that effect. I'll just mention one more possibility, which is that fiction's impact may not generalize to the broader category of a given social outcome. So again, our approach was a little bit different in that we use this latent variable modeling approach, where other studies are just looking at the association between a single measure and fiction reading. If we look at the association between a single measure and lifetime fiction exposure, for example, we replicate some of the associations seen in the prior literature. Although I'll also mention that if we control for reading ability, that effect goes away. Okay, so today I told you about a real-time fMRI neurofeedback study in which we're training people with and without schizophrenia to gain volitional control of the theory of mind network in a way that we hope has some positive behavioral consequences for social connection. I also told you about a really disappointing study in which we evaluated whether fiction reading causally improves social cognition, and if so, whether that might have some clinical utility. And I think the answer here, at least based on these data, are probably not. That's it.
Okay, so we have a couple minutes for questions. As I was saying when it was off, we have a couple minutes for questions. So, well, I don't see any hands yet. I'm sure everyone's thinking, well, hang on 1 minute, Anna. We have a few that have come in over, over Zoom. David?
Yes.
This question is, do you think fMRI might be used in determining a schizophrenia diagnosis and perhaps prognosis? For example, if the theory of mind areas are more engaged, does that mean there's a better chance for a positive course of treatment or functioning?
Yeah, I think we're like an incredibly long ways off from using neuroimaging to prognosticate about outcome or aid in diagnoses, at least right now, for a whole number of reasons. I mean, with the theory of mind stuff in particular, I mean, we see theory of mind impairment. So impairment to this network across a variety of disorders. It's not just schizophrenia. We see similar effects in autism and similar effects in other forms of psychopathology. So at least in terms of diagnosis, that wouldn't be helpful. I mean, maybe there are some data that speak to kind of how baseline social skills are related to prognosis. I mean, I'm sure there are. I don't know. You probably know that literature well, but I don't. You know, I don't know if and what fMRI would add on top of that. I mean, it's entirely possible that it would. I just don't know.
Okay. Anna? Yeah. It's time for your question.
Hello, thank you. Sorry, I'm losing my voice, but so I am a postdoc research fellow here, and I have particular interest in how social functioning impacts more relates to suicide risk. But I'm wondering your thoughts on the theory of mind network as this pathway between social disconnection and schizophrenia symptoms, if you would expect to see similar kind of like dysfunction in the TOM network between social connection and things like depression or anxiety, or would you hypothesize that the TOM network is a pathway that's maybe specific to linking social disconnection with schizophrenia?
Yeah, so I don't think it's a specific pathway at all. I think to the extent that risk for suicide, for example, involves some sort of disruption in a social information process like theory of mind, then yeah, we would expect to see, I think, disruptions or alterations in this network. Again, I don't think in any way that this is necessarily specific to theory of mind. I think there might be aspects of alterations that are specific to theory of mind. So, for example, if you remember the data I told you about with the office study at the very beginning, so that same study was done by a group looking at people with autism, and they showed hypoactivation in a different region of the theory of mind network. So to the extent that these regions within the network are performing different computations, they're representing slightly different things, and those different computations or slightly different things are being differentially altered in different forms of psychopathology, then yeah, I think maybe we would see some differences, but we just don't have a lot of that research.
Okay, so we just about out of time. I did want to mention that there are 5 really good questions that came through
okay,
over
yeah.
Zoom. We don't have time to go over them, so I encourage the people who sent those in to please contact David directly.
Yeah. Great.
Okay, so
Thank you.
yes, we'll send the questions to David. And I want to thank you, David, for a really interesting, stimulating discussion. And hopefully this will turn into some kind of intervention that can be done at our clinics.
I think so.
That would be
I hope
great.
so. Yeah.
And I want to thank everybody for coming, and we'll see you at the next Engel rounds next month. Have a good day, everybody.